I think for at least half of my career at UW-Madison, I've been really motivated to do research that connects directly with communities and involves participants in the communities. And so, I think some of us were doing citizen science before it was even called citizen science, but it's a definite passion of mine. And this project originated probably like close to 20 years ago, working with some elementary school teachers in Verona and doing some aquatic insect work with them and their students in some stormwater ponds. And so a lot of what we did really focused on collecting the larvae of different aquatic insects. And then uh, probably about 8 years ago, I had a group of really enthusiastic undergraduates, and we decided we wanted to do some studies of adult dragonflies and to see what they could tell us about, the health of those ponds, and also if dragonflies had potential to be an indicator where then we could start to use them in thinking about how systems respond to climate, how they respond to land use changes, how they respond to management. And that's really where it started. We just started with three little stormwater ponds. And then a few years ago, uh, we developed it as a citizen science project with a field guide to help volunteers learn to identify. And a few of you on this in this training were part of that. And so I want those of you that have done that to feel free at any time to interject in the chat. Some of your experiences. We, we spent some time this spring, as Hannah alluded to, updating the field guide. One, just making some formatting changes so that it was a little more user friendly. But also, one of the things that's happened since 2016 is that we have found uh, uh, more species of dragonflies, and so we wanted to add those to it as well. And so we'll go through a presentation, and my promise to you is I think by the time that we end this, that you'll be able to reliably and confidently identify about 10 to 12 dragonflies even before you get out into the field. And working from that base, uh, you'll be able to see several more species. So if we could move to the next slide, Hannah. And dragonflies I have always been really interested in dragonflies. I think they're very charismatic. They're what I think of when I think of ponds and lakes and wetlands, and they show up in a lot of poetry. And so here you can see a few haikus, and then one of my attempts at a haiku-like poem. And papery wings with tattered tips, yet the dragonfly flies. I saw this dragonfly, and all four of its wingtips were just really beaten up. And part of that would be likely from encounters with other dragonflies. But dragonflies are just amazing to me. And so I hope that's one of the things that you leave with today. And if we could have the next slide. So if you would, and you can enter this into the chat, if you would write down, just take about a minute, write down three things that you know about dragonflies, and write down three things that you hope to learn about dragonflies.
Yes, you can type right into the chat. Is anyone having a hard time finding that chat button? On the bottom of your screen, there should be an option to open chat.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some really good ideas and questions. So yeah, we often see them in summer. Uh, Many of them, a few of them first start showing up in April, and then we will sometimes see them into even October, just right up until the first hard frost. But the where we see the most of them is summer, uh, and yeah, they tend to fly more, and we tend to see them more on days where they're light winds and they're very, very fast and quick. Uh, and they do eat other animals, especially other insects, including even other dragonflies, mosquitoes for sure. They spend the bulk of their life in water, and we'll talk more about that. And I, I spent probably the first two-thirds of my career just studying the naiads or the larvae in the water, and I'm just still stunned at the colors in the adults. And we'll definitely talk about life cycles and different species. We'll talk about some observation tips and things to help you identify them. So yeah, really good. Thanks everybody. Next slide. And so some of the rationale for why we're doing what we're doing with dragonflies and with adult dragonflies is they're readily observable. Uh, Most of the adults are sort of between 1 and 3 inches in terms of the body length, and they're active during the day. And in Wisconsin, we can find them flying from April to October. Uh, they're For me, they're just iconic. They're a very, very old species. They're widespread. We find them virtually everywhere except Antarctica. And I would say I'm not going to be surprised if if we find some observations in Antarctica within the next decade with the way climate is changing. Uh, and one of the advantages is species vary in terms of the time of year they're flying, in terms of the habitat, in terms of land use and water quality. And so that gives us some opportunities to use them as an indicator to learn something about change in the environment, but also learning about maybe some practices we can do with conservation. One of the features is that it's a manageable number of species to learn. Uh, it's not as overwhelming as, say, if you were trying to learn beetles. I'm still overwhelmed by beetles. In Wisconsin, there are about 150 to 175 species, and they do respond to changes both daily and seasonally. And then they're ecologically very important. The naiads, or the aquatic larvae, they feed on anything smaller than them, including small fish and sometimes early stage tadpoles. If they're in a pond that doesn't have fish in it, they tend to be the top predator. And so they're a really important predator. And they're also fed on by a number of different species. The adults provide a real nice link to terrestrial environments, and the adults feed on virtually anything smaller that they can catch. And they're an especially important food for a lot of songbirds, especially wetland nesting birds. And I think as an ecologist, I'm interested because of their life cycle, they provide a really interesting link between land and water. So the next slide. And so here's the life cycle, and we'll start up at the top with mating at about 12 o'clock. And so they sexually reproduce. Uh, you will often see a male grasping or clasping a female right behind the head, and the eggs are fertilized. And at about 1 o'clock, you can see the eggs from the ovipositor on a female. They have a variety of egg laying patterns. Some you might see this summer going around and just dipping here and there, flying and dipping, flying and dipping. Others you might see them actually resting. Some even go underwater. Some will extrude a group of eggs, almost like you might expect from amphibians. Others, they're laid singly. There are a few that actually cut with a structure on their abdomen. They cut into plants like rushes, and they deposit their eggs inside there. The naiad you see at the bottom at 6 o'clock, and the species that we have in Wisconsin, they take from 1 to 5 years to go from egg to adult. And so the naiads, and this is what makes dragonflies really useful as an indicator of health, they experience everything that happens over a long time period. They emerge, and most of them need some kind of upright vegetation. The nearer to the pond, the better, because then they have less risk of being eaten while they're crawling out, and that's a real vulnerable time. It takes quite a bit of time to come out of that last exoskeleton. We call that an exuvium. Uh, and you can see that at 9 o'clock. And then they spend several hours drying their body. The exoskeleton is hardening. They're beginning to build up their strength. And you might well find a dragonfly that the colors are kind of washed out, and it might be flying fairly weakly compared to what you would expect a dragonfly to do. That's a stage that can last from 24 to 48 hours. Before then, they become a flying adult that's feeding, that is creating territories to mate, and then the cycle begins. So the next slide. And here's just some background. I like scientific trivia. I like ecological trivia. I mentioned that they're a very old group, and historically during the Paleozoic, so they're very old. They would have been significantly larger than they are today, about the size of something between a sharp-shinned hawk and a Cooper's hawk that you might have seen flying around a neighborhood. And we suspect the hypothesis is that they were able to get so large because of the higher percentage of oxygen in the environment. And so it could drive a higher metabolism. So next slide. And so if you look at this, uh, what do you notice? Maybe just write some things in the chat that you notice here. So you have 4 wings, 2 pairs, and the abdomen is white and fairly wide. It's a mirror image. Yeah, and the pattern on the wings. Uh, so it's got some black spots, and then it's also got clear patches. And someone had mentioned, what are some features that we can use in identification? And one of the first things that I usually notice is the abdomen. Uh, and then the second thing I notice is the pattern on the wings. And so the next series of slides, we're going to go through some groupings. And I encourage you to focus in on similarities and differences in the abdomen and then patterning on the wing. Yeah, that's fine, Hannah. Thanks. You anticipated me. Uh, so now if we look at this, what's the same? So what's similar? And then what's different? And again, if you could just jot some notes. I admit to feeling somewhat handcuffed. If any of you have ever been with a training or a workshop or a talk, I usually use a lot of interaction, and so I'm trying to adapt to a virtual environment. So yeah, some of them have a thinner abdomen, and it looks longer, especially in proportion to the body length. Some have wings that are open, some have wings that are closed out to the side versus laying down on the abdomen. And so on the left, we have a dragonfly, and it looks quite a bit like the dragonfly that you just saw. It's got, yeah, and the color on the wings, thank you. So it's got kind of a whitish abdomen and it's got black and white spots. So that one has some similarity. The one in the middle is a really common appearing damselfly. And so dragonflies and damselflies form a group taxonomically called the Odonata, or the toothed ones. And they share some features, but they also share some differences. And so the one in the middle, uh, it's got a longer and thinner abdomen. The wings are folded and folded together above the back, and the head, the eyes are more bulbous and set out on the side, and so that's a damselfly. And then the one on the right is fairly similar to the damselfly in terms of the abdomen and the eyes, and the overall body shape, but the wings are spread out. And that is another family of damselflies. And the reason to include that is sometimes people confuse these because we often think of dragonflies as having wings spread out and out to the sides, and this is an in-betweener. And so the one on the right is a spread wing damselfly. And so you might see some of those this summer as well. And so this should help you distinguish dragonflies and damselflies, which you'll find at the same ponds. One of the reasons that we're not currently including damselflies, and I think at some point we will, but they're just more challenging to identify. And so we thought we would start with a group that we had more confidence. Next slide, please. So now here's a group of 4, and all these are dragonflies. And so what are some similarities and what are some differences that you see? Yeah, so the color of the abdomen is different on all 4. Yep, different colors. And that's the first thing I see. Some of the wings have markings, others don't. Head color. Yeah, sort of in order of sort of the little, and part of why we're doing this is rather than you having to flip through a field guide when you go out, um, and just go through and it's like, oh, that one looks like that, is what I find more useful, and it's something I did when I was first learning birds, is I just found some different field marks, like the abdomen, like the color on the wings, like the head color, like the eye color. And so I have a little classification going in my head. And it's like, okay, well, this one has a red abdomen. So I know it's going to be one of these. This one has a blue abdomen. It'll be one of these. Oh, this one has green eyes. And so I usually go through sort of a sequence of the abdomen, the wings, then the eye color. And the eye color is a little more challenging to see. You can more readily see it when they're perching, but with some practice, you can see it when they're in flight. So the next slide. Now, here's a group that they all tend to have a white or a pale abdomen. And because we've labeled them, they're clearly 3 different species of dragonflies. And so, what are some differences that you notice? The wing pattern. The wing pattern is very different. Yeah. And where? So the pattern, they all have some black spots. Uh, and even they all have some white. If you look at the common whitetail, yeah, and the body color pattern, it's subtly different. If you look at the common whitetail, you'll notice at the base of the hind wings, there's a little white stripe between the black stripes. So even the common whitetail has some white on there. And then the widow skimmer in the middle has black and white on all of the wings. Uh, and it's a black spot and then a white spot and then a clear spot. And then the 12 spotted skimmer has 3 black spots on each wing and then with white spots in between. And I should point out that all of the things that we're looking at today and what the field guide addresses are males. There are many of the females are very distinctive. One of the reasons we're focusing on males is again to simplify identification, and also because of the behavior of the males, defending mating territories, trying to attract mates, we tend to see more males. So everything we're doing is focusing on males. Again, in the future, we may decide to add females to the field guide as well, but right now we're just focusing on the males. These three species are also three that we tend to see at just about every kind of pond. So they tend to be fairly tolerant. We see them in ponds that are have very low water clarity, real mucky looking. We see them at large ponds, see them at small ponds. But these are three that you would commonly expect to see. And I bet now you could confidently identify them. So the next slide. So here we have some with red abdomens. And so that's what they have in common. What are some differences? Yeah, the wing patterns is a big difference. And the saffron winged meadowhawk, and there are several species of meadowhawks. In fact, I would say probably close to half of the dragonflies that you'll see this summer may have a red abdomen. They tend to be pretty prominent. But the saffron winged meadowhawk tends to have fairly transparent wings, uh, but in the photo, and I think even more readily in the field, it's got a tint of saffron in the wings. And then we've got a red saddlebags in the middle, another one that we see pretty commonly. And it's got red stripes at the base of the hind wings. And then the calico pennant also has those saddlebags, but then it's got a series of spots uh, on each of the wings. So that would be a way that you would distinguish red saddlebags from the calico pennant. Next slide.
I have a question. Is the
Yeah,
calico pennant, is it just the photo or does it look smaller or is it smaller or is it just?
I think it's the photo. It tends to be fairly similar in size. And in fact, all three of these would be pretty similar in size. But yeah, good question. And in the field guide, and we got a sample page, and hopefully you just got the link. In the field guide, we do have body length comparisons in there because sometimes body length is useful.
I just dropped the link to the field guide into the chat again, so if you don't have it open already, you are welcome to open it.
Great. So now here we have some that, boy, you know, now that I look at it, these look really, really similar. Uh, hmm. I'm glad I've got the names so that I know they are different. So anybody see similarities or differences rather? Because I might well be confused by these in the field. Yeah, so the blue is actually a little bit different, but it's pretty subtle. Uh, the one that looks the most different yeah, is the blue dasher, and it's got these beautiful uh, tiger stripes, if you will, yellow and black stripes on the thorax. Uh, and then it tends to have a pretty prominent black tip to the abdomen. And we see blue dasher pretty frequently. I would tell you it's probably one of my favorite dragonflies. Part of that's because they perch a lot. And so if I stand still and quiet for a while at a pond while I'm making my observations, they tend to come and check me out. Uh, I think somebody even indicated early on that they've had them fly and perch on their fishing rod, and that's another strategy for making observations. We'll talk more about that later, but blue dasher is one that I don't know. I think it's fairly curious. The the great blue skimmer and the eastern pondhawk, they're a little more challenging, and part of that is body size. The great blue skimmer has a more robust or a thicker abdomen, and it tends to be larger. It's also fairly uncommon in Wisconsin, uh, but we wanted to add it because if it's around, and it might well be, we don't want to miss it. The eastern pond hawk tends to have pretty prominently green eyes, and so that's another distinctive feature. But here we got a couple examples where the differences aren't quite as distinct. So next slide, please. So here we have some that have brown to black abdomens. And so what do you notice? All of them have sort of a brown to black abdomen. Anyone pick up on any differences? Yeah, the yellow spots. Yeah, and the vibrance of the color. The black meadowhawk tends to be blacker, tends to be darker, whereas the beaver pond basket tail and the common basket tail, it tends to be more brown, less black, and then you can see that the beaver pond basket tail and the common basket tail, both have sort of yellow to orange spots on the abdomen. Uh, and the abdomen is thicker in the basket tails. Yeah, that's a good point. Uh, Meadowhawks, all the groups of meadowhawks, the abdomen tends to be a little thinner. Uh, does anyone notice something pretty distinctive on the hind wings of the common basket tail? Yeah, it looks kind of like the the saddlebags did almost. They're almost a triangular uh, basal spot, so right near the abdomen and only on the hind wing. And usually when I see it, I pick up right away. Oh, those are those triangular basal spots. And the common basket tail, it tends to be common. The black meadowhawk and the beaver pond basket tail, we haven't seen those as frequently, but they are around. Next slide, please.
Do these dragonflies have different colored eyes, or is that just the pictures?
I, I think they're subtly different. The black meadowhawk, they tend to be darker, but eye color would be trickier to look at. Yeah, good question. Now, here is a group, and I will tell you that the dot-tailed whiteface on the left, if we could go back to that there, I got so excited about 8 years ago when undergrads and I were first out because I had never seen this in the wild. I knew of it because I love flipping through pictures and field guides of things. It's it's a passion of mine. I love scientific illustrations, so I knew they existed. Uh, and I was giving them a field exam, and we were walking by, and I saw this one, and I didn't point it out. I wanted to see if one of the students pointed it out, and they did. I walked about like 5 yards past it, and somebody was like, "Oh, Dr. B, what is that?" Because we haven't seen that one before. One, they're fairly small. They're just a little bit more than an inch long, but they've got that distinctive white face. And so the front of their face is white. And then what else do you notice about that one? Because all three of these, frosted whiteface and the whiteface meadowhawk, they all have white faces. So what's different? All three are fairly small. The white-faced meadowhawk is more of a medium size dragonfly, and again the meadowhawks, they tend to be a little bit larger, more of a medium size. Yeah, the yellow dot on the tail. Uh, it's one of the first things that I usually see. Whereas the frosted whiteface, if you saw them side by side, the frosted whiteface is a little bit larger. But if you didn't see them side by side, it's always a tricky thing if you haven't seen a lot of dragonflies yet. But the frosted whiteface, it doesn't have that yellow dot, and the base of the abdomen is white. And then the white-faced meadowhawk has a distinctive red abdomen. So those are three of the meadowhawk, or three of the white faces, or three with white faces that we might see this summer. So the next slide. Oh, cool. So Christian's saying she saw tons of dot-tailed white faces in northern Wisconsin, and that brings up a good point. Is I think dot-tailed white faces, unless you spend some time, we tend to see the most obvious and the most common dragonflies first, and the darners tend to be one of those groups. Uh, and the darners tend to be about 3 inches long. But you've got this little dot-tailed whiteface that is usually only about an inch long and perches a lot, doesn't fly around a lot, and so they might appear to be more rare than they really are. And so what we want to do when we're making observations is just spend enough time where we're giving ourselves a better chance of seeing everything that's there that day. And so the darners tend to be the most noticeable dragonflies when you first walk up to a pond because they're very active flyers. They tend to be bright blues, sometimes with some reds. Uh, they're very fast. They'll do a lot of darting and dashing and dipping around. It's pretty common to see them flying in tandem, a male with a female. And so here are four of the darners that we might see when we go to ponds. And so what they all have in common is large size, but what are some of the differences that you see? So the colors and the patterns are different. Uh, sort of very different in the common green darner. It's the only one that we have up there that has a blue abdomen with then a green thorax, the middle part, and then green eyes. The comet darner, it it also has a green thorax, but look at the abdomen. And so the abdomen is red to orange. And somebody indicated the patterns. And so the comet darner and the green darner, they tend not to have stripes going around the abdomen or spots going down the length of the abdomen. And so that's another difference. And then also, you might notice stripes on the thorax, especially in this photo of the blue-eyed darner. The Canada darner also has stripes on the thorax. And to separate darners, it's going to be really helpful if you're patient enough to watch them so that you can see the stripes on the thorax. So if you stay there long enough for them to perch and maybe use some binoculars or a spotting scope, then you'll sometimes see that, oh, these have a pair of blue stripes. This one has a blue stripe and a green stripe. Well, this one has a notch in the thorax. And so those thoracic stripes will be really useful. And then also the blue-eyed darner has real distinctive blue eyes. And I recently saw one of those, and they're not very common in Wisconsin. I recently saw one of those at Silent Street Pond. And so they are around, and it's one that we don't see frequently. As you might guess, the common green darner is one that we see in many, many locations. The comet darner is interesting because it is, at least historically, been a primarily southern US species. It hasn't historically been a species that's been observed in the Midwest, but since about 2015 and the observations I've been doing, they've been showing up more frequently. And we've noted mated pairs flying in tandem and ovipositing. And so we think that this is a southern species, that its range is changing. And that could well be because of the Midwest warming. It might be changes in patterns of precipitation. But it seems like comet darner is one of those that may well be responding to climate change. And one of the things that we're really interested in is by having long-term records, like decades of records, it'll be important for us to know if they're truly coming and settling, and if they're settling, are other species that have historically been here disappearing? And we don't have the data to answer that yet, but the kind of data that we're collecting and you'll collect can help answer that. So the next slide. So here's an example from the field guide, just to orient you to what the field guide will look like. And so, and I really want to thank Heather Hasenstein, who did the layout and the graphic art. And then the photos came from photos primarily at Wisconsin Odonata survey, user photos that were submitted that weren't copyrighted, because dragonflies are really photogenic. And we've had some volunteer citizen scientists in the past that have also shared a bunch of just beautiful photographs. And so if that's an area of interest, we really encourage you to share those. So this isn't a group of the emeralds, and we haven't seen any examples of those. You'll know that you're looking at an emerald where you have a dark abdomen relatively thin abdomen, and then bright green eyes, almost metallic green eyes. And so the emeralds that we have are the Williamson's emerald, uh, the racket-tailed emerald, which in the field guide, if you look closely, it's got a little knob on the tail. It might, at first glance, when you see it at a distance, almost even look like a wasp, where it's got that knobby tip to the abdomen. And then the American emerald. And so then some things that are useful in the field guide is we've got those different things that I've used and students have used to help identify. We've usually got about 3 characteristics that you could focus in on, and then the body length, and then the habitat type. And then there are a few species, like especially those challenging meadowhawks, they vary a lot seasonally. And so you may have 2 species that look pretty similar, but one flies more in the spring and early summer, and then the other flies later in the fall. And so the flight season down in the lower right is useful. And then we've got on each page then a similar species that might be confusing. So this is an example out of the field guide. So next slide. And so as we've gone along, we've alluded to some questions. The number of species is really important in ecology. The more species that are there often tells us something about the habitat quality, the conditions there. There is a tendency for ponds and bodies of water that have higher water quality to support a higher number of species. It's also useful to notice what are the most common species we find. And this is where it's nice to have a watershed focus. So what are the most common species we find across the watershed in different types of bodies of water? I'm really interested in the least common species because I often think that they're telling me a story. And sometimes the story is that there is something at a particular pond that's meeting their needs that they're not finding at other ponds. And are there certain species that we tend to find with each other? Changes in the number of species over time, and changes in the composition of species. And let's see, so Cece had a question, how do I know if I'm counting the same one more than once? And that's a really good question. And so the answer to that is you don't. That's why we don't believe that we can get exact counts of things that we're seeing. We usually do more estimated counts of relative abundance. Like we know we're seeing a lot of common green darners. We know that we're seeing a few, like 1 to 10 of the dot-tailed whiteface. And for the most part, what we're hoping that everybody does is they do just recording what species they're seeing. Some of you may want to try to do relative abundance counts, and I'll share that information with you. But yeah, it's really challenging, and we know we can't get an exact count. Good question. And the next slide. So here's a little article, and there's a link, and this is just a paper that we were invited to write for the Madison West Neighborhood Association. And I'm at a point in my career where I love writing these kinds of articles now. You know, maybe it's something for the Sugar Flow, putting in a plug for our newsletter that Hannah does a really good job with. I think it would make me just giddy, and I think it would make Hannah giddy if one or more of you wrote an article about your experience this summer. I think that would just be be golden. I mean, I would just be overwhelmed by that. So I'll just put in a plug for that. Uh, but what's in there is just some examples of how the data might be used. And so some of the things that we found is that we do find more species the higher the water clarity is. And we tend to also find a higher abundance where I've done those relative abundance accounts. So how clear the water is seems to be something that matters. And it's also something that varies from pond to pond. And one of the things that showed up in this particular study, there was a brand new pond that was just dug the previous fall that I did observations at. And I was blown away because it had more species and it had more dragonflies than any pond I have ever looked at. And in the Dane County area, I've done observations at about 70 different ponds. That was not what I expected. In fact, we were suspecting that the older the pond got, the higher the number of species and more dragonflies it would support. And so we're really interested in finding some ponds that are relatively young in age, because many of the ponds I've looked at are around 10 to 30 years old. So next slide. Oh, and I missed a question, time of day. Yeah, thanks for that. And I think we've got a slide that lays out some of this, but my suggestion and what I do is I vary the time of day because there are some species that tend to fly more at dusk. And if I'm only doing observations, like the first time I did it, I was really focused on, I'm going to do all my observations between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. I'm going to do it more midday. And then I just happened to do an observation near me. I think it was a pond that Cece had looked at. I did it just before sunset. I saw two species I'd never seen before. And so I think varying the time of day to the extent that you can is useful. Let's see. So here, and this year we're going to recommend some sites because some of you like to be pointed to a direction, but I will also say I am absolutely happy if there is a pond near you that is more feasible for you to do observations. That you please do that. I know Kristen, I think, did a pond that was closer to her house and found some interesting things. But here are some ponds that I'm hoping people will do some observations at, and you can claim them as your own. Part of what I've done with these ponds is I know that there are some young ponds. I know that there's some older ponds. I know there's some bigger ponds. Some are a little more natural. And so you can see on the far right, the primary land cover. And so some have agriculture, some are more residential. The more variation that we have in what's surrounding the pond, that area that drains into the pond, the better to make sense of the stories that dragonflies will tell us. And so on here, I've got the GPS coordinates and then the nearest intersection. So next slide. And so here's what some of you have been asking. We are hoping that you will do essentially weekly observations during July. Anything earlier, anything later is wonderful. And weekly gives you some latitude with your life and also weather. because it's best to do observations on a relatively warm, temperature above 65 day with light winds, uh, and then relatively sunny. Dragonflies tend to be more active on those days. So a window of every 5 to 10 days is feasible. And then, as I alluded to, varying the time of day. Uh, if your life is such that you do it consistently at the same time, that's fine. We'll just know that from the data that you share. We do have turbidity tubes, and we have some information about that. Some of you have used those before. We also have a little video that we can send out to you. We didn't want to include it here because it just took too much time from the conversations. But it's a way for us to measure water clarity in shallow water systems. And so we have some tubes that we can get to people or arrange a pickup for people. And for those of you that are able to do that, it's a wonderful piece of data. We want you to perform your observation from the same general area of the pond. And what we're doing to standardize the effort is that you'll record each species that you see during a 10-minute observation period. And that's called a point count. So you're making an observation from the same point, the same place, for a specific amount of time. What I would encourage you to do is to not start that observation until you've been there about 10 minutes, because that allows you to acclimate. It also allows the dragonflies to become curious about you and start flying closer to you. I had a new volunteer that we were sitting at a pond on an observation deck at the outdoor learning lab. And at first, when we got there, she was like, "I can't see anything." And I was like, "Wait, let's just stand here and be still." And on that day, we saw 10 species, but we didn't start observing for about 5 to 10 minutes. When possible, take a photo of each of the species that you observe for verification. At first, this may seem impossible, but if you wait, and sometimes you may have to track one of them until it's perched a little bit. If you can't do that, if you see something that you're just not sure of, if you send me an email, I will try to get out to your pond, even hopefully arrange with you with some social distancing. I am wearing mask, and we can see if we can identify it together. It's also really helpful for me when you send me a photo, or if you send me a description with some field marks, if you tell me what you think it is. In fact, if you send me a photo and say, "Can you help me identify this?" my first email reply will be, "What do you think it is?" So it's helpful for me to do that. And then also to take representative photos of the pond, especially of the vegetation along the shore. So next slide. And here's the observation form. We will also send out a link to a database that if you're able and want to enter that, it's a international database. You can use this observation form. If you don't want to use that, you can just send this to us. And so we've got all the different species, and this observation form is truncated. It's missing a whole bunch of species on there. But just to orient you, you'll write down your name, your location, the date, and we'll have to add the time of day because that's important. And then you just check if you see whether you saw a Canada darner that day. And time of day is down farther. Sorry. So time of day, and then if you're measuring turbidity, then to record the turbidity, and then any notes. Because if you're out there, you're going to see things that won't necessarily fit into the observation form, but could be really, really useful. And so any notes that you want to make, I think long term, those can sometimes be very, very helpful. You know, if today, even though you're not counting them, if today you saw especially a lot of red saddlebags, just write that down. That's a good place to do it. So the next slide. And here's just the database. Again, what we'll send out is a link to it and then an example filled out. But you can get started even without that. I don't want this to deter people from getting started and making observations. Okay, now here's the fun part. Let's see how much we know. And let's see, I said that I believe you can reliably identify 10 to 12 species. Oh, and Dick had asked, how's the field guide organized? So we got groupings, kind of like I went through with darners, with emeralds, with skimmers. We got groupings like that. And also the electronic field guide is hyperlinked as well. So you can go from the table of contents, then right to that page. So yeah, good question. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so pick the best answer here. Is this a dragonfly or a damselfly? So I can see that you are all experts already. And so now anyone want to say what kind of damselfly that is? Spread wing, yes, thank you. And if you hear low growling, it's not me. I've got a pair of dogs that are one savors her dog chew and terrorizes the other. So it's not me. I don't growl often. So next slide. Hey, so do you agree or disagree that this is a 12-spotted skimmer? Oh, excellent. And so anyone want to share why that's a 12-spotted skimmer?
You are welcome to unmute yourself for the additional
Yeah,
question.
yeah, please do. It would make me so happy. See how the black spots on the wings, and if you count them, there are 12.
Thank you, Janice.
Okay, next. So next one. And is this a northern bluet? And northern bluets are really, really common. So I'm seeing some disagrees. And who would like to say why that's not a northern bluet? Or what it is? Yeah, that's a blue dasher. And if you look, you'll see those tiger stripes on the thorax. So very good. And this is a real tricky one because we didn't do a whole lot of talking about the groups. I mean, we did talk about we talked about each of those, but rather than worrying about identifying specifically which dragonfly it is, which group would it be in? A, pennants, B, white faces, C, skimmers, or D, emeralds? Excellent. Yeah, emeralds with the big green eyes. Yeah. And which of these photos below is of a widow skimmer? Oh, and I think there should have been a D on here for a none of the above. Oh, no, you're correct, Hannah. I'm bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So the widow skimmer is B. Does anybody want to say what C is? Yep, whitetail, common whitetail. Excellent. Now, oh, if we could stay, yeah. So A, we didn't include in the any of the slides that we had, but what are some features that you see? Like, what are some of the field marks? What do you notice? The abdomen, and the abdomen kind of tapers. And yeah, the gold wing edges, and that's really distinctive on this one. And it's kind of brownish, but a pale brownish. And so there are a small group of these that you might see. So those are good observations. And next slide, please. So is this a calico pennant? And you did see a calico pennant. And this is probably the most challenging one in here. Okay. And it sort of looks like a calico pennant, but some of you are disagreeing. And so somebody is disagreeing. Yeah, I don't see the saddles. I don't see the saddles.
Saddlebags. Yeah.
And the other feature on this is the wing color. They're kind of golden. Yeah, and they are very pretty. And this particular dragonfly is a Halloween pennant. And so it is in that group. And this is one that I very often will find perched in tall grasses around the edge of the pond rather than flying as much. So it tends to be more perched and less flying. And so let's see what we have next. So this looks like a lot like a common green darner to me. Well, Amanda, you disagree? But I'm an expert. I study dragonflies professionally. Why do you disagree with me? And Cece knows me. So why do you think this is not a common green darner? Yeah, it's a comet darner. The common green darner has the blue abdomen, and the comet darner has the red to orange abdomen. The thorax looks very, very similar, and they're very similar in size. In fact, the first ones that I saw of these at a pond, and I happened to see them at that brand new pond I mentioned. The first one that I saw, I wasn't convinced I was seeing what I was seeing. My first thought was, oh, that's a comet darner. And then it's like, we don't have comet darners here. But turns out we do. So next slide. Oh, okay. So which of these is a frosted white face? And one of these you have not seen in the slides that we went through. Or actually two of them. Yeah, none of these are. So none of these are frosted white faces. And I include that because, you now have, and I do believe you have probably 10 to 12 dragonflies that you will know when you see. And so now you can compare. And so it's really useful to know that, oh, this looks like, but it's not. And that's a really good practice to have. And if you see something that looks sort of like, but not quite, trust that instinct and then use your field guide to try to hone in on it. And so next slide. Okay. So yeah, we can have questions, and we'll also kind of summarize by some of the things we're going to send out to you. But yeah, thanks everybody.
Is there a key that sort of follows, you talked about looking at abdomen and a progression. Is there a key that sort of follows that approach?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dick. There are some taxonomic keys. They tend to be more for if you've actually collected the dragonfly and you've killed it and then pinned it.
Okay.
And so you can sit down and look through. And that's part of why we wanted to use more of a field guide approach. But essentially what we did together is you began building up a key, a classification key this morning.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and it's not strictly dichotomous, like does it have red abdomen, yes or no, but kind of like that. The starting point for me, and I think for many people, is the color of the abdomen. And then the patterns on the wings, then eye color, then patterns on thorax, size becomes then another, and then when they're flying. So, you do, I think part of why I try to teach trainings like this is I want people to have that kind of script, that classification scheme running in their head when they go out there. Because my experience is the first time I go, I tend to be overloaded with all the dragonflies I'm seeing. And sometimes I like, oh God, they all look alike. But then if I can start focusing in on, okay, let's notice some patterns colors of the abdomen. So yeah, good question.
Is it
Yeah, I think
useful?
that's been really helpful, just to sort of know what to key off of. And
Hmm.
I was just wondering, for me, it'd be helpful if the field guide was kind of organized, maybe along those keys too, or so that, because when I go to the field guide to look at something, it's still sort of just leaping through it all, trying to find stuff that matches.
Yeah, we did have there is some organization to it in groupings that I think will help.
Okay.
And so that was intentional. There are, some cases where, like, one of the biggest groups that we have where there's the most variation are the skimmers. And then probably the second group is the darners. But it is organized into groupings, and we did want to add a table of contents. So I think you could go and at least say, okay, is this a darner or is this one of the skimmers? Recognizing skimmers include about half of the dragonflies that we'll see. But yeah. And so I thought I saw a question. Yeah, so flight patterns, there are, like one that the darners tend to patrol a lot and fly a lot over open water. And then in comparison, one of the smaller dragonflies that you will see at a lot of ponds is the eastern amberwing. And I very often will find those flying very close to the shoreline, like, just right off the shoreline and fairly low to the ground. And the eastern pondhawk and the blue dasher, they both tend to dash around. They do a lot of darting, but they also tend to hug the shoreline. So flight pattern is something that you can use.
I think Laura might have had a question as well.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to ask if it's useful if you're able to only narrow it down to a family or narrow it down to several different possibilities. Is it useful to record that information?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And thanks, I had forgotten about that. Part of what you can include in the notes is, let's say, like in the field guide, you will find red saddlebags and Carolina saddlebags. I have trouble distinguishing those. We know that both are around. We know that red saddlebags is more common, and it's a pretty subtle difference. And so if in that case, if you recorded red saddlebags, but in the note, you said, I'm just not sure, it might be a Carolina saddlebags. Or if you saw, like, say, eastern pondhawk, but it was pretty big and you wondered if it might be a great blue skimmer, just make that note, because then that'll do two things. One, it will alert me and I can come out and try to make an observation to confirm or be as confused as you are. It also will then help us decide how we want to include that in the data. So, including something like emeralds, you might, I don't know for sure if it's an American emerald or a Williamson's emerald. So any that are close like that, yeah, you can record that and record that in the notes.
Okay.
And so some of what we'll be sending out to you are the observation forms, and then also an FAQ sheet that I think we've answered most of the questions on there, but they might be good reminders for you. The one thing on that FAQ is we've got a bunch of useful resources, like the Wisconsin Odonata survey. We've used a lot of materials from them. That has all the species in Wisconsin. Then there is Wisconsin Dragonfly Society. There's a Dragonfly ID app, and then there's iNaturalist. And so those are all things that I think we've got the links to on there, and we'll be sending that.
Yep, you can expect an email from me sometime next week, and I will also be connecting with you individually to see if you want to continue or if you want to be a Dragonfly monitor this summer, and then helping you find a pond if that's the path that you continue on. So we will be in contact. Thank you all for joining us today. Were there any last minute questions?
I would also say that the last time we did this, we made it a contest. And so we'll also send contests out for the Great Dragonfly Hunt in July.
Yes.
And there will be wonderful, wonderful prizes for, oh, way to go, you're great. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks everyone.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, you can email the info@uppersugar.org. But again, we'll be in contact with you next week.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you. It's been great. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Hannah. Great job.